Pantheon Rise of the Fallen has been in open development for a while now, so naturally, over time, some of the information about it on the internet may appear to become muddled or even contradictory. Part of that is probably due to some unclear marketing from the developers, particularly in the early days, but to some degree, there will always be some misunderstandings. And I'd hate for that to cause some people to dismiss something they might otherwise be interested in, or even worse, when alpha, beta, and release come around, to realize that what they were hoping Pantheon would be isn't quite what it actually is. So as someone who's been following the project very, very closely for almost 5 years now, and even played the game myself on several occasions, I'm going to break down and debunk some of the most common myths that I see about Pantheon. If you don't want to be out of the loop as development on Pantheon progresses, hit the subscribe button now because that's exactly what this channel is dedicated to. I'm not affiliated with the project. Like I said, I've just been following it for a long time, and I like to take what I learn and condense it down just to make it easier for you to track the project as well. If you've been watching my channel since the early days, you may remember that I made a video that attempted to clarify some misunderstandings about Pantheon back in 2018. And while it was good back then, times have changed, I've changed, and there's a lot more information available now, so I think it's time to tackle this some more. I do still like to organize things in lists, so let's count down the top 5 myths about Pantheon that can and need to be cleared up, and hit them with some facts. Most myths start with an ounce of truth, and in this case, I can see why some people might think that there won't be any PvP in Pantheon, because so far the developers have hardly talked at all about their plans for it. The game is heavily focused on PvE, but that doesn't mean there won't be any PvP. The developers have said that the game will launch with at least one server that has a PvP rule set. But what I'd like to point out here is that creative director Chris Joppa-Perkins is a huge fan of PvP, and he's already cooking up some interesting ideas for PvP when the time comes. In fact, when I was at the Pantheon booth at PAX East 2018, I overheard him talking about some of his long-term goals for PvP, which he relayed on the Pantheon Plus show in May 2020.
Now, what we talked about at PAX, I actually remember this conversation now, which is that we want to explore what I would call kind of an evolution of the Guild War premise, where, you know, if you remember back in EQ, you could slash Guild War as a guild leader, and if the other guild leader typed slash Guild War back, then you were now PvP enabled. Would love to see something like that, but actually have dedicated zones that would be a place that guilds could kind of go a little bit more all out in that sense, and the things that you could vie for, you know, whether it's a keep that, you know, a guild could basically siege and take ownership of, and then guild wars were maybe for the purpose of trying to wrestle that keep away from a competing guild, and then once you do have ownership of that keep, you know, then you can you know, begin through even just like NPC activity, like the mining and the accumulation of certain resources and whatnot, and it could be a zone that other players even could come in and you know, have access to certain things as long as Guild War wasn't going on. But that's one of the things I would love to see us be able to do. Whether that's something we'll be able to have by launch, it's probably not likely, but it's something that is like a very
great expansion. It's a great expansion.
Yeah, I think you could see an expansion thing on something like that for sure.
While again, those are more like long-term plans, the key is that Joppa is a firm believer that good PvP is rooted in solid PvE mechanics. So that's why they're focusing on that first, and then once that's in a good place, then he says we'll hear a lot more about PvP. As you probably know, Pantheon is largely a crowd-funded game, and interestingly enough, it seems like most people seem to fall into 2 categories. Those that think Pantheon is fully funded, meaning that the developers already have enough money to guarantee that they can pay their bills until launch day, or that they're financially desperate, on dire straits, and in danger of shutting down any day now. Neither of those are true. In reality, they're somewhere in between. But I'll start by addressing the myth that the project is fully funded, because that's one that I actually feel partially responsible for. Although it originated back in 2018 from this comment on the official Pantheon Facebook account. Quote, "We have a set pace and current funding has allowed us to build the game to this point and can be continued through to launch," end quote. Back then, I was very early in my YouTube journey, and I made a video which quoted this comment, assuming that it meant that they were fully funded, which was not true. I know I wasn't the only one who misinterpreted this, but in retrospect, I should have double-checked first, and I should have known that if they were fully funded, they would have just said that rather than phrasing it in such a roundabout way. Anyway, that quote caused confusion that still crops up periodically, like most recently when the January 2021 producer's letter announced that Visionary Realms had received a 7-figure investment, but specified that it does not mean they are fully funded. It should be noted, however, that producer Brendyn already set the record straight on what the original comment meant by "can be continued through to launch." And I think the best explanation is this post on the official forums from October 2020. Quote, "We are currently prepared to launch the game with the current velocity of crowdfunding. In that scenario, it means a much longer development cycle and launching without all the features, graphic fidelity, and content we would like. But it is spec'd out and planned. In the ideal situation, which is what we aim for, funding increases, whether by investment, partner deals, or an increase in crowdfunding. And then a bigger, fuller game launches much sooner. The only doomsday scenario is if crowdfunding stops, and we have no reason to believe that will happen as long as we are able to earn it by showing our progress," end quote. So you can see why he had to clarify that the 7-figure investment last month isn't full funding, because there's a pretty significant difference between being on track to having enough money to complete the game and already having that money in the bank. Either way, the new investment is a good sign that things are at least trending in the right direction. Speaking of that investment, it seems to have reinvigorated another myth that's been around a long time but has been coming up a lot more recently. And that is the idea that the investors in Pantheon have creative control over the game's design. This leads to a fear that someone might swoop in and basically bribe the devs to turn Pantheon into some sort of free-to-play, casual slot machine cash grab. It's pretty normal to be cynical about big money. There's plenty of cases in the game industry where financial overlords have gotten greedy and transformed their otherwise good games into cash cows. But let me remind you, for one thing, investments in Pantheon are nothing new. Visionary Realms has been soliciting outside investments ever since the Kickstarter campaign failed to meet its goal in 2014, and they received their first angel investment in 2015. Even as they've acquired more investments since then, the overall creative vision has been largely unchanged, and I'll get into that more later in this video. But the investors in Pantheon are not corporate giants with quarterly earnings reports and all that jazz. These are private investors. And likewise, Visionary Realms isn't a corporate giant either. This isn't just another product in their catalog. It's much more personal to them. Brendyn addressed this on the official forums in January 2021. Quote, "We've said it before and we'll say it again. We have turned down offers that would have provided us full funding, but required us to give up creative control. We're not interested in selling out like that. We are all in this to make the game we have been wanting for decades. So no, we will always be in control of the decisions. It is the entire point behind the company and the game. Add to that, every single one of our investors has the same values. We simply do not partner when it is not a fit. We won't give up those core principles," end quote. As nice as that is to hear, it also probably would be fair to think, well, he probably wouldn't admit to selling out, but I, for one, have actually been fortunate enough to get another perspective on this. At one point in 2019, one of the private investors in Pantheon actually reached out to me on his own, and we had a great one-on-one conversation. I actually recognized this person because he was a part of the community just like you and me. He wants to see Pantheon come to life just as much as anyone else. He just also happens to be very wealthy, and unsurprisingly kept that to himself. So, out of respect for him, I won't say any more than that, and I haven't spoken with any of the other investors, but it was reassuring to me that there are in fact people like that in the community who are willing and able to simply help the project reach its fullest potential. Kind of like the myth about there not being any PvP, I can see why some people might go as far to say that Pantheon is designed to require grouping, especially among people who are intrigued by Pantheon as a whole, but then hear things like cooperation, community, etc., and fear that their limited amount of time will somehow prevent them from being able to make any progress. I could go on about how Pantheon isn't really hardcore in the traditional sense, and you can still group even if you only have a couple hours, but for now, I'll just talk about soloing, because even though Pantheon puts more of a focus on grouping than most recent MMOs, that doesn't mean that you won't be able to solo at all.
I mean, you could say that Pantheon's a solo-friendly game in the sense that we don't do anything to penalize soloing or even discourage soloing arbitrarily. It really just comes down to the nature of the content that you're faced with in any given area. If you can figure out a way to solo it, then please, that's great. But the key is the game is being designed with the kind of challenge that will, in many cases, at least encourage players to band together to some degree to overcome those challenges.
So it's not about being required to do things one way or the other, it's just about what is more efficient for you. Although keep in mind that naturally some classes will be better at soloing than others. Because classes in Pantheon aren't designed to be able to do everything on their own, if you are alone, you'll probably have to be more creative and strategic in how you approach encounters. The myth I see more often than any other that really needs to be settled is that Pantheon is meant to just be a reskinned version of EverQuest. Basically, a game that has all the same mechanics as EverQuest, just with better graphics and maybe a few quality of life improvements. And again, there's a little truth to that in some ways, but at the same time, that's actually pretty far from what Pantheon was created to be. But you shouldn't take my word for it. Let's hear it straight from Chris Perkins when he appeared on the Voices of Terminus show at the end of 2020. It's a few minutes long, but it's incredibly important, so listen up.
EQ clone. I think you have to think about what that actually means, because EverQuest, when you look at EverQuest from a design perspective, it's an extremely simple game, right? I mean, we're talking very simple in terms of actual gameplay systems. EverQuest was the first, 3D MMORPG experience. It was one of the first times that, people in their teenage years, which I was, were just being introduced to the concept of the internet, chat rooms, and now all of a sudden you've got this, persistent online world where you can talk to people just like a chat room, meet real people, develop real relationships, and do it all within the context of this incredible RPG experience. And you're talking about just this mind-blowing thing where now 2 decades later, more so, that's old hat. That's normal. That's totally normal. So when you think about, okay, what does an EQ clone actually mean? A true EQ clone would be an incredibly simplistic game with very simple mechanics and very bare bones stuff, which, judging from even just our pre-alpha sessions so far, we can't get our differentiating systems online fast enough, because it's amazing how quickly people grow weary of that, go out into the world, kill things, loot things, level up. So I think it's really important to say that what EverQuest did was it defined a type of MMORPG experience. It defined a type of experience that has not, in my opinion anyway, has not been replicated in spirit. I'm not saying it hasn't been, specific mechanic wise. And so a lot of what Pantheon is setting out to do is look back at that classic era of EverQuest and vanilla World of Warcraft and some of the things that made those games so impactful from a high level experience point of view. Things like social interaction, things like challenge with actual risk, associated with it. Things like immersion and a game that felt more like you were living in and engaging with a more of a real world than a kind of facade of a game lobby theme park type experience. But then what we're doing is we're taking 20 years of MMOs, 20 plus years of MMO games and development and progress and evolution, and we're saying like, okay, what gives Pantheon the right, like what gives Pantheon the right to stand up among so many peers and demand attention? Like that's the way that I'm looking at Pantheon, and some of that is unapologetically embracing some of those tenets, those potentially in some cases polarizing, or at least, you know, some tenets that not the mass populations of people won't immediately warm to. That's some of it, but a lot of it too, and more so, is looking at how to take some of these fundamental systems that make these games so good and so fun and sticky and evolve them in a way that feels fresh. And so there's so much to say there, but I hope that there are not still those who think that Pantheon at any point in time, today or, you know, 6-7 years ago, was ever about just reskinning EverQuest. That was never the plan, never the goal. The goal is to be a renaissance of that era of what made those games so good, and almost kind of this unique breed in terms of their philosophy, and then find that place in the modern gamut.
I'm sure some people will still try to argue that the vision for Pantheon has changed over time, and that the death of the original visionary Brad McQuaid has since caused the team to shift their focus to try to appeal to a broader audience. But this is simply not true. People who say this probably did not fully understand the vision to begin with, and therefore projected their own wishes onto it. And it isn't until now that we're actually starting to see more of the true vision come to life. Brad already made EverQuest and didn't feel like just making it again. He wanted to push some new boundaries. Let me prove it to you with this blog post from Brad McQuaid, dated April 26th, 2016. Quote, "We aren't making an EQ emulator. We're going to have to implement and try out some systems that are totally new, as well as implement and try out systems that are similar to ones tried in more recent games, but to execute on them better. The only people I think this truly won't resonate with would be 1, those who truly do want us to make an EQ emulator, and 2, those who really don't want any newbies in Pantheon, who would be content to have Pantheon merely be a haven for those who have felt abandoned and orphaned by the newer MMOs. If you fall into one or both of those categories, then I'm going to have to be really straight up with you. Pantheon isn't what you think or want it to be." Hopefully you think about all of this more and change your viewpoint, but I'm going to stand firm on those two statements. Not an emulator, and not only for the old school gamer, end quote. I really hope you learned something from this video. If there are any other myths or misconceptions about Pantheon that you think need some more light shed on them, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make a video about it. I hope that you will continue to pursue the truth just as I am, and to fact check things before assuming and spreading rumors. Remember, I'm just a regular guy who does his homework. The facts are out there. They may not always be what you think they are, and they may be hard to find sometimes, but it is worth it. So, until the next video, stay curious and adventure on.